Everybody's excited about the Morgan indictments. I wrote a commentary last night saying that as glad as we are about them, because they bring attention to the manipulation issue. It's the investment banks, the bullion banks' misconduct has not been our emphasis. Our emphasis has been intervention by governments and central banks, and we're still emphasizing that. That's still our main pursuit.
So, Chris, maybe it's a flush out of the two-prong. I mean, when I look at the manipulation and the suppression of precious metals or commodities in general, I mean, it kind of goes back to Peter Warburton's 2000 article, that great article, that stanza that you guys have constantly shown on your sites, of it being kind of a two-prong approach where they kind of incentivize the banks, commercial banks, to go into the markets and suppress prices toward the downside for their own little bonuses, et cetera, knowing that they're doing it with the central banks and the governments kind of looking the other way. And so I guess that's what brings up this kind of question as why now, I guess, is really what we need to kind of dig into perhaps.
Right. Yeah. I'm hoping these indictments will lead to some incrimination of the government itself, but I am puzzled really why the government is going after Morgan so aggressively, because surely Morgan, having been a government agent in so many respects over the years, has just as much dirt on the government as the government's going to have on Morgan.
Right. I mean, and that's kind of a question. Like, obviously, the Department of Justice doesn't even use the name JPMorgan at all in any of the suit filings or on their website. I mean, it's very interesting the way that they respect the brand of these major commercial banks.
Yeah.
Something's up as far as them having dirt versus one another. So, yeah, it's all interesting, and it's going to lead to questions that we can't answer, but it's worth, I guess, putting them up there and to think about so the listeners can think about them too.
Sure.
All right, cool. What we'll do then is take a brief pause and kind of jump into it, and that conversation we just had, I may even inject that in if I can edit it right, just because I think we may gloss over it in the conversation that we end up having. Not only a strong end to the week for the monetary precious metal prices, but also this week began with one of the biggest bombshell news items and criminal lawsuits filed against the often alleged silver and other precious metals market-rigging bank, JPMorgan Chase. Before we get back to our interview with this week's guest, Chris Powell of Gold Antitrust Action Committee, a quick update on fiat price action for the precious metals. The silver spot price closed the week at 18 fiat Federal Reserve notes per troy ounce, up about 50 cents on the week. Gold spot price ran about $30 up on an ounce, closing right below 1,520 fiat Fed notes per troy ounce. The spot platinum price finished flat for the week, right around 950 fiat dollars per troy ounce, while palladium hit a new nominal price record high in Fed notes, closing at around 1,645 fiat dollars per troy ounce. Now to the week's most important bullion-related headline. JPMorgan's precious metal desk was a criminal enterprise, U.S. says. That's literally what Bloomberg published on Monday morning, September 16th, 2019. We'll be right back with GATA.org's Chris Powell to talk about that and much more, right after this word from my Bullion podcast sponsor. SD Bullion is a high-volume, physical precious metals dealer here in the USA. If you are acquiring an investment-grade bullion position, be sure to bookmark www.sdbullion.com/deals, where each and every week we source some of the best bullion deals for our over 100,000 customers worldwide. At the bottom right section of our website, you can also easily subscribe to our weekly Bullion Deals mailing list, where you will receive weekly notifications of valuable product deals that may be exclusive only to our SD Bullion mailing list. Stay tuned to sdbullion.com, the lowest price, period. Welcome to this week's Metals and Markets Wrap. I'm your host, James Anderson of SD Bullion. With us this week, a returning guest is Mr. Chris Powell. He is the Secretary and Treasurer of the Gold Antitrust Action Committee. You can visit their website at GATA.org. Hey, Chris, thank you so much for taking time today to come on the show.
Oh, I'm delighted to be with you.
So, Chris, last time we spoke was a while back. It was in January of 2018. And now I've been watching you guys over at GATA pretty much ever since I started investing and working in this space in the late 2000s. But you guys have been doing this really since 1990, the year 2000. So if there's anyone who understands what GATA is out there and knows the battle you've been waging and the work you've been doing, I mean, if anyone has the right to be kind of cynical, it's perhaps you guys. But to begin today's show, we really have to kind of cover, what's been happening. You've been doing this for 2 decades, but this news event that happened this week was pretty tremendous. It definitely was something that took a lot of people back. I want to get your thoughts on what, as far as the Department of Justice's criminal lawsuit using RICO laws against these former precious metal trading heads and executives at JPMorgan. I mean, this is a pretty unprecedented story.
Yeah, it was sensational, really. Not only for the government to be indicting traders at such a big investment bank, but to call it organized crime, to call the operation, really call the bank a criminal enterprise. That did get the attention of a lot of people, since the government has already gotten confessions and convictions from 2 former traders. There's, I don't think really any question anymore that there's been manipulation of the metals market, but I try to stress to people that the manipulation that the government has gotten convictions in and is seeking more convictions in is not really the manipulation that GATA has been complaining about for the last 20 years. The government is going after an investment bank here, and GATA, by contrast, has been going against governments and central banks for their surreptitious interventions in the markets that amount to market manipulation. Now, excuse me, we're certain that governments and central banks have been using bullion banks, investment banks, as intermediaries for their interventions and their market manipulations. And it would not surprise me if the prosecution of these Morgan traders is going to prompt the traders to make accusations against their own bank and against possibly other banks and other governments, and against the U.S. government itself. We'll just have to see. But I do want to acknowledge that as much as we're glad of the publicity that these indictments are bringing to the manipulation issue, we think the manipulation issue is far bigger than some misconduct by traders at investment banks. The manipulation issue here is in our opinion, a matter of long-standing basic policy of governments and central banks in the West to suppress monetary metals prices as a matter of policy to support government currencies and help control interest rates.
So sometimes, Chris, and I just be, when I'm talking about, your thesis and the arguments that you make, one of the greatest interviews I've ever seen with you was done in 2014. It's on Vimeo. I'm going to make sure to embed it in the show notes so people can sit, because the interviewer did a great job of getting out from you a lot of the points. And sometimes I feel a little bit intimidated when I get to speak with you. I want to make sure I'm getting out as many points as I can. One of the most important points that you always bring up is the 1934, what happened in 1933 with the gold confiscation and the Gold Reserve Act in 1934, which essentially gives the government, the government just says flat out, like, we can manipulate any market anywhere at any time, any place, etc. I mean, they just literally by fiat just write that as law, and that's been the case ever since, pretty much.
Yes, and I really saw that up close when I attended the single hearing in our consultant Reg Howe's lawsuit against the Bank for International Settlements, the Federal Reserve, Treasury Department, and some investment banks in U.S. District Court in Boston in 2001. the lawsuit accused the agencies, the banks, BIS, Fed, Treasury, of rigging the gold market. An assistant U.S. attorney moved to dismiss the lawsuit motion, which was really essentially a summary judgment motion. Summary judgment is a motion that argues to the court that even if you consider all the complaints in a lawsuit to be accurate, there is no remedy at law, and the lawsuit has to be dismissed. An assistant U.S. attorney got up at the hearing on that lawsuit, moving for dismissal, and very candidly stated that while the government did not necessarily admit to doing what the lawsuit complained of, that is, the government was not admitting that it was manipulating the gold market, the assistant U.S. attorney said the government claimed the power to do everything the lawsuit complained of under the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. Now, this assertion really is, I think, supported by the refusal of the Treasury Department and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to answer some very simple questions over the last year, questions first posed to them by GATA, but now being posed to them for more than a year by U.S. Representative Alex Mooney of West Virginia. That is, the Treasury Department has been asked by the congressman to specify which markets it is secretly trading in and for what purposes. The congressman, as GATA has done, has also asked the Commodity Futures Trading Commission whether manipulative trading undertaken by the U.S. government or brokers engaged by the U.S. government is subject to the jurisdiction of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. The commission has refused to answer that question too. Now, I construe these refusals to answer very simple questions by the Treasury Department and the CFTC to mean that, as I heard that U.S. attorney in U.S. District Court in Boston in 2001, the U.S. government does indeed construe the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 to give it the power to secretly rig any market in the world at any time. And I would encourage people who are advocates of free markets and certainly investors in the monetary metals sector to ask their members of Congress to reiterate Representative Mooney's questions to the Fed and the Treasury and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and try to get answers. Does the U.S. government acknowledge that it has the power to rig any market in the world in secret, and is the government rigging markets? I don't know why we can't get answers to those questions other than it would expose really a pretty sensational policy.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a level of policy where they would argue that's a national security matter. I've heard you describe it being, the manipulation or the suppression of commodities and gold and precious metals, monetary metals, et cetera, is akin to, they'd rather talk less about that than the secrets to their bombs, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very interesting. Obviously, you're touching on some of the biggest spokes of power, right? I mean, if I always find it interesting when I talk to people that they would think living in an empire, that empire would ever leave the price of something to chance. Like in history, empires always, get too large and then they start trying to dictate what's going on in the free market. And that's just essentially what we have here, and only in so many words, I suppose.
Well, the control of the gold price is really control of all the currency markets. It's control of interest rates. It's essentially control of all capital, labor, goods, and services in the world. And there's really not too much more on the planet than that. Nuclear weapons, they can only destroy the world. But if you control the gold price, you control the economy of the world. You control all financial valuations, and that's why rigging the gold market has been so important to modern central banking. Gold is the former world reserve currency, is potentially a world reserve currency again, and it's a currency that's not really under the control naturally of any one government. It's basically the secret knowledge of the financial universe, and we've been trying to drag this out in the public, and we have compiled many documents showing that gold market rigging is long-standing central bank policy. We have many admissions of that. There's stuff on the State Department archive and in the minute book of the Bank of England, and there's memoirs and statements by central bankers through the years, some of them quite recent, that admit, when they think that no one outside their circle is listening, that the control of the gold price is essential to the maintenance of the power of central banks. They do not want the world, they do not want individuals, the public, to have access to a form of money that is outside government's control.
So, Chris, I've heard you before talk a little bit about this battle between capital and labor. Maybe we can put that in different words. Sometimes capital and labor is maybe too old of wordage. That's something that maybe someone might have said at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century. I mean, is it essentially big money versus people who do middle class work? I mean, typically who produce things, or even lower class people who produce real goods in space, bringing commodities to the market, etc. I mean, is this not necessarily what we're living under? Is a system that favors the powerful moneyed interests versus those that actually produce real things?
Well, of course, there is a very powerful financial interest in the world, and it is not necessarily aligned with the interests of the public generally, or working people. This is really the oldest political struggle, I think, in civilization. You go back to the founding states of humanity, and there very quickly becomes a struggle between capital and labor. Now, GATA is not advocating socialism or communism or anything like that. We're simply advocating transparency in government. You can't have a democratic government unless you really can know what the government is doing. You can't have a successful economy unless you know what the government is doing. We believe in free and transparent markets and limited and accountable government, and you can't have that when all the big financial monetary decisions are being made by unelected agencies and made largely in secret, and those agencies are doing things that hugely affect the economy, and doing them in secret, and you can't have any input into them. We want a competitive capitalist economy with limited and accountable government, and we don't have it right now, and that's what we're struggling against.
Well, speaking about the potential collusion between supposed democratic states and undemocratic states, I find the timing of this all very interesting. We talked a little bit in the pre-interview, which I may end up injecting into this, but the timing of this story with JPMorgan and the head of the precious metals desk getting thrown under RICO laws, making it sound like they're essentially the mafia, which for a metaphor, it's a pretty good one. But we have next month a situation now where, in a supposed hot trade war, Chinese gold contracts, the comics are coming out. They're going to have gold Chinese futures contracts coming out. One denominated in fiat US dollars, and another denominated in supposedly manipulated fiat yuan is coming out. So what it appears to me, and this is just speculation, and it's just me thinking out loud. I mean, possibly China said, hey, we'd like to be involved in your markets. Maybe you need to police them a little more, because they've been, they obviously knew a lot about JPMorgan. They talked about it in 2009 about the ongoing suppression of commodities. You see it in WikiLeaks cables and other things like that, where China literally knows, yes, our markets are not as clean or transparent as we like to pretend. Perhaps China said, hey, why don't you clean up and bring us some heads and show the fact that you're going to be serious about having a fairer market. Maybe that's possibly what's happening. I don't know. But either way, it looks like China and the U.S. are going to have policy moving forward when it comes to the gold price. Is that not, I mean, am I far off base by thinking that way?
Well, certainly China knows all about the gold price suppression policy of the Western central banks. There have been, as you mentioned, the WikiLeaks cables were cables that included cables from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing to the State Department in Washington, and many of these cables were translations of reports and commentaries in the government-controlled news media in China, which very explicitly acknowledged gold price suppression by Western central banks to maintain the supremacy of the dollar and U.S. imperialism. So we know China knows all about the policy, and since the reports are cabled back from Beijing to the State Department of Washington, we know that not only does China know all about gold price suppression policy, but the United States knows all about China's knowledge of gold price suppression policy. We know that Russia knows all about it because of a speech that was given by the deputy chairman of the Bank of Russia, Oleg Mozaiskov, to the summer meeting of the London Bullion Market Association at the Kavinsky Hotel in Moscow in 2004. The only words of English Mozaiskov spoke were Gold Antitrust Action Committee. Now, to the best of our knowledge, we had no contact with anyone in Russia up to that time, so we know that as early as 2004, the Russian government was paying very close attention to GATA's work. I think Mozaiskov mentioned GATA to the London bullion bankers as a way of telling them that Russia was beginning to figure out what they were up to in London with gold sales and leases, and they knew that gold was being used to suppress commodity prices and to really put the developing world down, and Russia is part of the developing world. So we know that at least since 2004, Russia has known all about Western gold price suppression policy. Now, I would caution everybody that Russia and China are not our saviors, our heroes in the pursuit of free and transparent markets. And no government will ever want gold to trade freely. No government will ever want the world to have an independent reserve currency. Gold as a reserve currency, as an independent form of money, is a terror to governments. It severely restricts the government power of money creation. So China doesn't want a free trading gold price any more than Russia does, any more than the United States does. But China and Russia and some other countries increasingly realize that gold gives them an exit from the U.S. dollar-controlled financial system. It's a weapon that they can use against U.S. sanctions, and so they will acquire gold and increasingly use gold to bypass the dollar system. And at some point in the future, when gold becomes inconvenient to them, I'm sure they will try to suppress gold in their own way for their own purposes. But for the moment, this growing division between pro-gold and anti-gold central banks in the world is working in gold's favor. The U.S. economists Paul Brodsky and Lee Quaintance wrote a paper about 8 years ago that I suspect is very insightful. They were speculating that the real policy of central banks around the world, both Western and Eastern, for some time now, certainly more than a decade, has been to redistribute world gold reserves among the nations so that countries with excessive U.S. dollar foreign exchange reserves would be hedged with gold upon the inevitable devaluation of the dollar and the conversion to a a different sort of financial system. I don't think Brodsky and Quaintance had any inside information about that. That was their conclusion from what they were observing. But I think they very possibly were right that once the gold has been redistributed a little more fairly, there will be a meeting among the major central banks to arrange an international currency revaluation that probably will revalue gold upward relative to all currencies, but especially the dollar, and to bring about new exchange rates. This happens from time to time. There have been international currency agreements throughout history, and I think it's very possible that that's what we're heading for right now.
Yeah, that reminds me of the time when Tim Geithner went over to China in 2009, fresh off the financial crisis, and all of a sudden China just started buying huge amounts of gold and became the number one miner of gold. And the Western powers obviously shipped a lot of that gold over to China. So anyone can kind of put two and two together. Perhaps there's been a tacit agreement in the last 10 years between China and the West to let them kind of diverge out of some of those U.S. dollar denominated investments or treasuries or whatever they have as far as savings, and put some into gold perhaps. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about power and the way it wants to stay in power. You would do it in a controlled manner.
China does not want the gold price exploding, at least not today. I mean, the central banks who are acquiring gold, I think, want to acquire it as inexpensively as they can, and they don't want the price to explode until they've got all that they think that they need. People should remember that prior to 2013, lots of analysts were saying that there was a Chinese put under the gold price that China would buy any gold that was on offer. And then in April 2013, over the course of a weekend, we had a terrible smash in the gold price for no apparent reason anybody could see. The gold price over the weekend went down something like $200 out of nowhere, and it took me a couple of weeks to really suppose what had happened here. But I think what had happened was that China had pulled its bid for gold in 2013, probably because the central banks agreed that the price was getting away from them, was rising too fast, that it was going to start affecting all market prices in a negative way. And certainly the gold price would not have dropped that far that quickly without China's assent. China has something like a $3 or $4 trillion foreign exchange reserve. Even today, it was very big back then. And when your foreign exchange surplus is that large, you can run any market in the world, and nothing happens in any market in the world without your consent or cooperation. And I'm pretty sure that in April 2013 that gold smash was arranged with China's cooperation, because the gold redistribution scheme was not complete and was in danger of being short-circuited by really retail demand. And now we're 6 years later. I think a lot of gold has been acquired by central banks. A lot of gold purchases have been in central banks in the last year. Perhaps we're closer to the conclusion of this gold redistribution. But we'll have to see. We've been at this for 20 years, and things about the suppression of gold, the rigging of the market, get more obvious to us every day. But we haven't reached the end game yet. It will be a revaluation. I'm not sure if I will live to see it, but gold has been revalued periodically to devalue debt, to diminish the burden of interest on the world economy. A Scottish economist, Peter Miller, wrote a long paper about that some years ago that's still on our internet site. Debt will have to be devalued. Interest burdens are just too high, and gold will figure in that. Central banks will probably reliquefy themselves during a debt devaluation by revaluing gold upward. It's a very powerful tool that they have.
So, Chris, as far back as 2014, you've been documenting the fact that the CME Group, which controls the COMEX, NYMEX, these same exchanges where a lot of these supposed RICO crimes have gone on, they've been offering this thing called the CBIP program, which is the Central Bank Incentive Program for foreign financial powers and institutions, so that they can come into the CME Group commodities markets and, if they so wish, perhaps to move price discovery where it might best fit their agenda. So I'm wondering, do you think the PBOC is going to be taking any type of action in the CBIP program, and what markets might they be moving in the coming years?
Well, we don't know who is using the central bank incentive program, but the wonderful thing about it is that it's public record. The central bank incentive program is there for all to see on the internet site of the CME Group, and it's there in the filings of the CME Group at the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, so that central banks and governments are getting volume trading discounts for their secret trading of all major commodity futures contracts in the United States. That's a public record. It can't be discussed in mainstream financial news organizations. It's simply too sensitive. But that if we had any real financial journalism in the United States, that's one place where it would go. It would examine the central bank incentive program, and it would ask CME Group and CFTC and Securities and Exchange Commission and various governments, what's this about? Who is trading secretly in the commodity markets in the United States, and for what purposes? Financial journalism would put similar questions to the Bank for International Settlements. We have a very brilliant consultant, Bob Lamborn, who reviews the monthly statements of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, to go through the footnotes and then calculate the amount of gold swaps and leases that the BIS is engaged in any particular month. The BIS doesn't report this plainly. You have to do all this math in the footnotes of the monthly reports, but the Bank for International Settlements is trading gold and gold derivatives on behalf of its central bank members every month. And when GATA a year or so ago asked the BIS, "Hey, what's this gold trading that you're doing? Why are you trading gold? And who are the real parties in interest here? And what's the objective of this trading?" BIS very promptly and cordially replied to me saying, "Oh, we never answer questions like this. Go ask the central banks." Well, of course, the central banks don't answer those questions either. But if you doubt that central banks are involved in a daily, if not hourly, trading of in the gold market, all you have to do is go to the sources. There's documents showing that they're involved, and you can ask them, and you can get the door slammed in your face. And I think you can construe from that what they're doing would not withstand public scrutiny.
Yeah, I mean, I in that question when I asked you, I almost started laughing out loud because the truth is stranger than any fiction anyone could ever write. And the fact that this has been going on for 5 years is, you've described this gold price manipulation as something almost as evil as World War II expropriation, where you describe, how Nazi Germany was rigging the FX markets and really hurting a lot of people. I mean, I don't think people really fully understand because all the pain and suffering is broken up into so many millions and billions of people across the world. So maybe it doesn't register, but I mean, it is extremely serious, the type of crimes that we're.
Well, it's subtle. It's disguised. We have this misunderstanding of the Nazi occupation of World War II. We imagine it to have been largely a matter of the SS and the Gestapo running around Europe with bayonets on their rifles and going into the central banks and taking the gold, which they did, and going into the Louvre and taking the paintings off the wall and just taking whatever they wanted from any occupied country. And they did stuff like that. But the primary mechanism of the Nazi exploitation of occupied Europe during World War II was the rigging of the currency markets, because once the Nazis got hold of a of an occupied country's central bank, they changed the exchange rate between the local national currency and the Reichsmark, and they changed it grotesquely in favor of the Reichsmark. And as a result, all commerce in Europe turned out to flow the production of Europe out of occupied Europe and into Nazi Germany, and nothing flowed back. The Nazi control of the currency markets in occupied Europe turned every citizen of an occupied country into an agent of the occupation, because if you used your domestic currency, you were facilitating the flow of production into Germany. And of course, just as we do now in the West here, practically, the Nazis outlawed the use of gold as currency, because gold was the escape from the rigged currency markets. Well, that's how the Nazis exploited occupied Europe during World War II. It wasn't really at the point of the bayonet. It was through the rigging of the currency markets. A book has been written about this in the last few years called Hitler's Beneficiaries, which I would recommend to people. That documents the currency market rigging. Well, this is really what the West has been doing to the developing world for the last 50 years. If we rig the currency markets in favor of the dollar and the Western currencies, well, we really force the developing countries to sell their production to the developed countries at something less than a free market price. Now, if the United States, occupied Africa or South America with troops and started taking goods out of the factories and out of the shops and shipping them back to the United States, everybody in those occupied countries would understand what was being done to them and by whom. But if you rig the currency markets, nobody can see it. Nobody understands it.
Yeah, sometimes when I read about current present-day Argentina or Venezuela and the way that they rig their local currency markets, it's kind of, like you said, the United States version is subtle, and it's done on a huge scale. Whereas if you go to some of these small micro, the states where criminals are pretty much running the place, you could see it in full steroid form. But I get exactly what you're trying to get at here. I mean, it's a very subtle methodology of taking value from people without them fully understanding how they're getting screwed over. All right, well, Chris, there's a couple more things I wanted to get to. There's just the revolving door point that you've always made. I found this interesting, and there's been some really good. This will be like the last thing we jump through here, and then I'll let you run. So I don't want to take more of your time. But Ronan Manley and Craig Hemke have been doing some really great work on the JPMorgan story. It turns out that the head of the precious metals desk, who's now charged with financial crimes and the RICO laws, this guy named Michael Nowak, he is a current member of the LBMA board of directors.
Yeah, I imagine he may be resigning soon if he hasn't already.
Now, there's another guy out there that was pointed out. His guy was named Sid Tipple, and he's not been charged with any crime. But I do find it interesting that he was the co-head of global metals trading at JPMorgan, which, he was basically the co-head with Michael Nowak, who is a guy who's charged with crimes. They worked together for 8 years, and Sid Tipples worked out of London. That guy was on the LBMA board from 2015 into the July of 2019. He just jumped ship, it looks like 2 months ago, from the LBMA board, and he jumped ship from JPMorgan in 2018. So Sid Tipples looks like he's A-okay, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that the LBMA is not necessarily the master of the universe when it comes to the gold market. Not only do they have people on their board of disrepute, allegedly, they also are very late a lot of times when it comes to blood gold scandals. I think we've had Ohio Precious Metals, Ella Metal, Republic Metals. Currently, there's been one that was published on FX by the New York Times alleging that Asahi had some blood gold get through to various corporations. So LBMA might want to look into that if they're paying any attention. I wonder, just in terms of like the revolving door, there's even another story too, revolving this guy, Michael Nowak, who this one I think is incredibly, it's pretty incredible. Obviously Bill Murphy in the interview he did with us a couple days ago, one of my colleagues, Paul, over at Silver Doctors, he's like, the Department of Justice is doing the work that the CFTC should have done all along, right? If anyone knows anything about the CFTC, obviously they were started in around 1975 with Comics Gold, and if you look at the GATA website, you would have found the fact that WikiLeaks had U.S. Treasury cables describing the fact that they had meetings with the London bullion market makers in the end of 1974, right before gold went re-legalized. I guess the U.S. Treasury was worried that U.S. citizens might buy a lot of gold and stop using the fiat U.S. dollar as much, and so they tried to figure out a way to introduce volatility, I suppose, into the gold price. And so the very idea that the CFTC was set up to perhaps police this kind of stuff is kind of naive, I think, if you know the true history. I wanted to get to the point of what's going on today, though, real quick, and get your thoughts. This guy, Michael Nowak, former head of JPMorgan's precious metal trading desk, charged with RICO law crimes from the U.S. Department of Justice. There was a long 5-year silver investigation that the CFTC supposedly did from 2000 and it looks like 9 to 2013 or 2008 to 2013. By the end of it, the CFTC Division of Enforcement head, this guy named David Meister, he was the head of it. They basically said that there was no evidence of prosecutable crimes. David Meister quit a couple days later and went and worked at a law firm. Who cares what the name is? The bottom line is this. The same guy who was the Division of Enforcement head, David Meister, is now going to represent Michael Nowak in this coming trial against the U.S. Department of Justice. So this revolving door point that you make all the time is happening right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, I'm not making as much of this as my friends are, including Craig, and it's because the former CFTC lawyer, who's now representing the Morgan trader charged with rigging the gold market, is not representing the Morgan guy before the lawyer's former agency, the CFTC. Rather, he's representing the Morgan guy before federal court against a prosecution by the Justice Department. Now, if the former CFTC lawyer was representing the Morgan guy against charges brought by the former CFTC lawyer's own former agency, the CFTC, then I'd say that was, obviously influence peddling, and it was corrupt, and in many circumstances around the country that kind of thing is prohibited. But here the lawyer is representing the Morgan guy against an agency that the former CFTC lawyer has not been employed by. I mean, all the same, these people are in the same field, but you got to remember, most lawyers are just hired guns, and if you pay them enough on Tuesday, they will contradict everything that they said on Monday, because that's their job, and in fairness to them, that's candidly what they're doing. Now, I don't think this necessarily means anything that the former CFTC lawyer is defending the Morgan guy. These lawyers for regulatory agencies just commonly leave the agencies and go practice regulatory law as best they can. They don't necessarily lobby their own agencies again, because that's really can be a conflict of interest. But it's certainly interesting that a former CFTC guy is representing the Morgan trader against the Justice Department. But I don't think it necessarily means anything. We'll have to just watch it. Now, certainly, the CFTC has a lot to answer for here, because its supposed investigation of the metals markets, and particularly the silver market for manipulation in recent years, overlaps largely the same time period that the Justice Department has been investigating, and the Justice Department has charged crimes here that occurred while the CFTC was supposedly investigating the same thing and couldn't find anything. A very compelling question right now for the CFTC is, how the hell did you miss what the Justice Department has just been finding? Of course, that's a question I'm sure they will not answer. I believe Congressman Mooney put that question to the CFTC in his letter a year ago, and has gotten no answer about that. The CFTC has an awful lot to answer for. I can only speculate as to how the CFTC missed what the Justice Department has found. It should have been much easier for the CFTC to find this kind of spoofing, because the CFTC has access to the trading records. All they had to do, I think, was to look at the records they always had access to. And why didn't they do it? I don't know. I can speculate that the CFTC dropped the silver business because it was told that the U.S. government was the real party of interest in the suspect trading, and that the U.S. government has the power to rig markets in secret and can do it directly or through brokers. Maybe the CFTC was told that the manipulative trading that they perceived was actually undertaken at the instigation of the U.S. government, and under the Gold Reserve Act of '34, it was exempt from regulation. That's just speculation on my part, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's what the CFTC was told, and the Justice Department is determined differently. That I don't know, maybe Morgan was front-running government trades, and maybe that's the real distinction that's being made here.
Maybe they were just useful, greedy idiots, those traders over at JPMorgan, for the government's behest, right? I mean, it's...
Well, we know from the Justice Department indictments and convictions that have been gotten against Morgan, and the fines that have been issued against Morgan, that Morgan often traced against the interest of its own clients, and was even front running its own clients' trades to cheat them. So sure. I think Morgan is a criminal enterprise in ways far beyond what the government has already accused them of being.
So that article that you posted yesterday from Pam Martins was incredible. It's a great article. I want to make sure to put that in the show notes for readers down there. She asked the question, is Jamie Dimon going to finally lose his job over this kind of thing? And then she goes through and lists, I mean, it's the amount of stuff that she lists is impossible to fully keep track of. So it's great to see someone out there documenting so many scandals with that bank.
Yeah, it's just amazing that the bank has not been shut down by the government and put into government receivership and broken up. The misconduct and criminality is just comprehensive.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Well, I want to leave the listeners with some hope, if I can, Chris. Maybe, I know that you've talked about it, so people should be a little bit up in arms about the fact that this may be going on, and they should investigate it further. First and foremost, how are they going to find your website, and then any message you might give to them?
Sure. We are at GATA.org for Gold Antitrust Action Committee. We're a nonprofit educational and civil rights organization recognized as tax exempt by the Internal Revenue Service under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. Any financial contributions to us are federally tax exempt, and we rely on those contributions to survive from month to month. We have a mailing list. I think there's about 8,000 people on it right now. We try to send out a few dispatches every day, material of interest to monetary metals investors and people interested in free and transparent markets generally. We often publicize documents establishing market rigging. We have a documentation archive on our internet site. If people are looking for any particular document, I'm very glad to assist them in the search through our archive. People can reach me at cpowell, at CPOWELL, at GATA.org, and very glad to add people to our mailing list for free. You can do that on our homepage. If you have any trouble with it, please just email me.
Well, Chris, on behalf of all the listeners, I know the majority out there who are listening are they really do thank you and think a lot about your organization, the guys who work with you, Bill Murphy, Ed Steer, yourself, and the others that have worked with you all throughout the years. We do owe a debt of gratitude for you guys' eternal fight, it seems, to keep this in the minds of people who actually pay attention. So thank you so much for taking the time today and for all that you've been doing.
Oh, thanks for your interest.